August 13th, 2025, Scarborough Shoal, South China Sea. Out of the morning haze, a Type-052D destroyer cuts directly across the path of the USS Higgins. Distance, approximately 300 yards. Over the radio, U.S. warship, you are in Chinese waters. At the same time, Chinese Coast Guard ships blast water cannons at Filipino fishermen, their wooden boats nearly capsizing. The numbers? 96 VLS cells beneath the crew's boots, SPY-1D tracking 200-plus contacts, and on the Chinese side, YJ-18 anti-ship missiles, approximately 290 miles, supersonic. One wrong turn and steel meets steel. Within hours, Washington responds. P-8, a patrol flights, and MQ-4C. Triton over the reefs, RC-135 SYGINT, listening in, and a Virginia-class submarine diving below the edge of the plateau. Rules of engagement remain, hold fire. But for how long? Were shots fired? Or did something happen that no one expected? Stay with me as we uncover the maneuvers, the secret dazzle versus damage choices, and the moment patience turns into fire. 7:46 a.m. The closest pass yet. A Chinese frigate cut just 300 yards across Higgins's bow, the wake rocking nearby fishing boats. On the bridge, sailors gripped the rails, waiting for the order that never came. This wasn't just a patrol anymore. It was seconds from disaster. The USS Higgins, 9,000 tons of steel on a freedom of navigation mission, kept steady course. For Washington, it was proof that sea lanes must remain open. For Beijing, it was a provocation to exploit. From the haze, more silhouettes emerged. Type-052D destroyers and Type-054A frigates, circling like predators. Within minutes, they closed in, steel flashing in the sun. Over the radio came the warning. U.S. warship, you are in Chinese waters. Leave immediately or face consequences. Chinese ships weaved closer, cutting across Higgins's bow at brutal angles. Wakes churned violently, threatening to swamp fishing boats. On board, sailors clenched the rails, eyes glued to radar. Every move felt like a countdown. One wrong order, one accidental shot, and the South China Sea would erupt. On the deck of the USS Higgins, every command was a lifeline. Steady course, maintain speed. Every glance at the radar, every reflection of sunlight on an approaching Type-052D destroyer or Type-054A frigate was a cue for vigilance. Knuckles whitened as sailors gripped steel railings, eyes scanning every ripple, every shadow. Minimal chatter, absolute discipline. Hours passed, 8:15, 8:42, 9:03 a.m., each minute stretching taut like a wire. 96 vertical launch cells lay dormant beneath their feet, each capable of firing tomahawks over 1,000 miles, SM-2 interceptors, or harpoons that could shred hulls in seconds. The raw power of the USS Higgins could have obliterated the approaching flotilla in moments. Not a single missile was armed, not a single gun elevated. Outside, the Chinese flotilla moved with precise coordination. Type-052D destroyers, led by Rear Admiral Li Wei, glided through the waves, their Type-346A Dragon Eye ASA radars scanning the horizon, tracking hundreds of maritime and aerial contacts simultaneously. Type-054A frigates, commanded by Captain Zhang Rong, mirrored the destroyer's maneuvers, their Type-3823D radars providing layered situational awareness. Crew members trained at the People's Liberation Army Navy's Dalian Naval Academy executed engine throttles and helm adjustments with split-second timing, their hands steady despite the tense proximity to the Higgins. Electronic warfare specialists monitored frequencies, testing U.S. comms while coordinating with UAVs and coastal radar stations. Every wake, every engine roar, every reflected sun glint was choreographed, a deliberate psychological test of patience, discipline, and nerve. At the other side, the tension was almost unbearable. U.S. sailors described it later as standing before a loaded cannon, knowing the trigger was theirs, yet forbidden to pull. Each passing hour brought the flotilla closer. Maneuvers sharper, risks higher. One misstep could ignite a conflict with global consequences. And above all, an unspoken truth hovered over the waves. The world was watching. Scarborough Shoal, barely visible beneath the waves, had become a stage. Discipline, patience, and restraint were as lethal as any missile. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the potential for escalation waited. Silent, inevitable, and entirely out of anyone's control. By 9:18 a.m., the Chinese ships had closed further, the Type-054A frigates now cutting arcs mere 300 yards from Higgins's bow. Every turn, every calculated wake sent tremors through the destroyer's hull. Rear Admiral Li Wei's orders crackled across the bridge. Maintain formation, pressure them, do not collide. On the frigates, crew members trained at Dalian Naval Academy adjusted throttles, monitored Type-382 radars, and kept eyes on every Higgins movement, sweat glinting under the morning sun. Electronic warfare teams transmitted simulated jamming signals, testing reactions without touching the ship. Every motion was choreography, every engine roar a taunt, every reflected glare from steel a subtle message. Who would break first? Inside Higgins, tension threaded every corner of the ship. Their commander scanned radar feeds, murmuring, "Keep them in sight, steady." Bosun's mate chief leaned over the railing, voice tight. "Every ripple counts. Don't blink." The petty officer adjusted the radar display repeatedly, fingers trembling slightly but disciplined, noting the changing distance of each Chinese vessel. Across the bridge, a lieutenant coordinated communications silently, eyes flicking to both crew and approaching hulls. Every sailor felt the pulse of danger, every heartbeat measured in microseconds, every breath a conscious act of restraint. As the minutes ticked past, 9:31, 9:47, 10:02, a subtle war waged in minds and nerves rather than ordnance. Every heartbeat, every suppressed reaction became a test of control. And in that crucible of restraint, the first true lesson of the standoff emerged. Power could be wielded without a single missile fired, and provocation was as much a weapon as firepower itself. The spray of seawater from a passing Chinese frigate hit the deck of the USS Higgins, each droplet a reminder of the provocation taking place mere yards away. Shouted insults over crackling radios echoed across the bridge, calling the Americans intruders, aggressors, even vermin. Every man aboard felt the sting, not of water, but of humiliation. Frustration built like a storm, coiling tight in their chests. Yet discipline held. Every instinct to retaliate, to unleash the fury their training demanded, was suppressed. This was not weakness. This was power measured in restraint. Beneath the calm exterior, technology whispered its lethal potential. The ship's SPY-1D radar hummed steadily, tracking over 200 contacts simultaneously. Every Chinese destroyer, every frigate, even the scattering Filipino fishing boats, nothing escaped the digital eye. The crew knew that in moments they could strike with precision, missiles and guns capable of turning steel hulls into debris in under 2 minutes. Yet the order was clear: endure. The patience of trained sailors had become a weapon as formidable as any missile. For Beijing, the operation was meant to project dominance, to intimidate and force compliance. But the closer one looked, the cracks in the facade were evident. Their ships, aggressive and imposing, were shadowing a destroyer tied into the most sophisticated command and control network on Earth, the Aegis system. Every move was being observed, calculated, and contained. What appeared as strength was, in truth, a calculated desperation to prove defiance while knowing the consequences of escalation could be catastrophic. The lesson was unmistakable. True power lies not in acting on every insult, every threat, but in the discipline to measure the moment, to control the response. Restraint became strategy. The USS Higgins had enough firepower to obliterate the flotilla, yet the men held steady, signaling to the world that the most advanced navy measured its strength not by explosions, but by composure. And yet, a haunting question lingered in the air. What happens when patience finally runs out? When the weight of provocation, the threat to allies, and the relentless pressure of intimidation reaches a breaking point? The answer remained unseen, hanging over Scarborough Shoal like a storm ready to erupt. For now, the world watched, waiting for a single spark to decide whether this confrontation would remain a display of restraint or ignite something far more dangerous. On the deck of the USS Higgins, the crew felt the pulse of near-limitless power beneath their feet. 96 vertical launch cells stretched across the destroyer's deck, each loaded with SM-2 surface-to-air missiles, ESSM interceptors, or Tomahawk cruise missiles, capable of striking targets over 1,000 miles away with pinpoint accuracy. Each Tomahawk carried a 1,000-pound warhead and cost roughly $1.87 million per missile. ESSMs zipped at Mach 4, ready to shred incoming threats, while SM-2s formed a defensive umbrella against aircraft and missiles alike. Alone, the Higgins arsenal exceeded the combined firepower of the entire Philippine Navy, whose fleet of 18 ships could not match the destroyer's offensive or defensive capabilities. Its Phalanx CYWS could fire 45,520mm rounds per minute, a spinning wall of steel able to vaporize incoming missiles or drones before they reached the hull. Below, the SPY-1D radar scanned over 200 targets simultaneously, distinguishing threats from flares or decoys with unerring precision. Across the haze, the Chinese flotilla painted an imposing picture. Type-052D destroyers carried YJ-18 supersonic anti-ship missiles, reaching speeds of Mach 2.5 and ranges of nearly 290 miles, while Type-054A frigates boasted dozens more missile tubes and short-range CIWS. Each ship carried 800 to 1,000 tons of fuel, engines humming with 60,000 plus horsepower, capable of speeds exceeding 30 knots. On paper, the fleet projected raw strength. On the water, however, every aggressive maneuver, bow cutting across the Higgins path, engines thrumming, wakes surging, was being measured, calculated, and patiently endured. The USS Higgins was no lone warrior. Integrated into the Aegis combat system, its sensors relayed data to orbiting satellites and submerged nuclear submarines, giving the Americans real-time tracking of every vessel, every jet, every torpedo in the surrounding 200 nautical miles. Any real exchange would be devastating. Within 15 minutes, the Chinese ships could be reduced to fiery wrecks, each missile salvo leaving nothing but twisted steel and smoke. Yet for the sailors aboard, the paradox weighed heavily. All the destructive power of missiles worth hundreds of millions, engines burning tens of thousands of gallons of JP-5 fuel per day, lay dormant. Orders were to endure, to hold, to measure restraint as the ultimate weapon. Scarborough Shoal, a mere ring of reefs barely visible above water, had become the theater of this silent duel. Raw power versus disciplined resolve, brash intimidation versus calculated patience. And just beyond the horizon, in the shallow waters the destroyer could not touch, fishing boats hung in the balance, fragile against the steel giants circling above. Before the looming steel of two superpowers, more than 40 small Filipino fishing boats drifted toward Scarborough Shoal. These wooden skiffs, 20 to 30 feet long, with outboard motors of 50 to 100 horsepower, had been a lifeline for generations. Families, grandparents, parents, and children worked together at dawn, casting nylon nets worth hundreds of dollars, hauling in mackerel, squid, and milkfish that could feed their communities or be sold at local markets for 500 to 1,000 pesos a day. Scarborough Shoal, a scattering of jagged rocks and shallow reefs barely visible at high tide, had always been their sanctuary, but strategically located in the South China Sea, near some of the world's busiest shipping lanes and richest fishing grounds, it had long been contested by China, claimed by the Philippines, and fiercely guarded by whoever held presence. On that morning, calm waters and the hum of small engines were shattered. From the haze, Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels surged forward, 1,500 to 2,000 tons of steel slicing the waves, engines roaring, sirens screaming. Water cannons blasted wooden decks with such force that nets were shredded, catch lost, and families drenched head to toe. Boats were rammed, rocked violently, sometimes nearly capsizing entire crews. Radios crackled with abuse. Trespassers, vermin, to be cleaned from the sea. Each word bit like steel. Each spray of water drove humiliation deeper than salt or splintering wood. One fisherman, voice shaking, remembered clinging to the railing of his boat as his father tried to steady the engine. They chased us like we were vermin, to be cleaned from the sea. Nets floated in tatters, fish sank into the waves, and livelihoods dissolved in minutes. What should have been a routine morning, a quiet labor of survival, became a desperate scramble against forces far beyond their control. By sunrise, at least a dozen boats had turned back, nets shredded, catch lost, families' earnings gone. Hunger now stalked homes once sustained by the sea. Financial ruin loomed. The moral wound was deeper. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration had ruled Scarborough Shoal within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Here, law was powerless. Steel dictated reality. Even as the USS Higgins loomed offshore, its vertical launch cells ready to unleash missiles worth millions, no intervention came. Radars tracked every move, crew alert to each aggressive maneuver, yet only endurance held. The reef had become a crucible where ordinary lives and geopolitical power collided, and far beyond, unseen observers watched, the tension rippling toward stakes that reached well beyond these fragile wooden boats. Scarborough Shoal rises like a jagged crown above the waves, a fragile cluster of rocks and reefs barely visible at high tide, roughly 124 nautical miles west of Luzon, the Philippines' largest island. Today, it conceals rich fishing grounds, coral gardens, and shallow passages that have sustained Filipino communities for generations. But the shoal has long been more than a source of fish. Historical maps from the Ming Dynasty depict the reefs, and in 1782, the British navigational charts already marked it as a key reference point for trade through the South China Sea. Over centuries, Scarborough became a silent witness to the maritime ambitions of empires, Spanish galleons passing nearby, Japanese patrols in World War II, and post-war Philippine fishing fleets. Its location on the western edge of the Luzon Strait makes it a natural choke point, a narrow gateway between the Philippine Sea and the broader South China Sea. Control here offers influence over one of the busiest maritime corridors on the planet, nearly a third of global shipping, more than 60,000 merchant vessels, and 15 million barrels of crude oil moving daily through channels threaded among reefs and islands. Whoever dominates Scarborough can project leverage far beyond Southeast Asia. China's modern presence is strategic, informed by both history and ambition. Beijing claims historical rights dating back centuries, and today it enforces those claims with Type 052D destroyers, Type 054A frigates, and Coast Guard vessels. On August 13, 2025, those assets circled the USS Higgins in maneuvers designed to intimidate and test resolve. Every close pass, every wave crashing against the Higgins's hull, every reflected glint from Chinese radar masts was a calculated provocation. Type 346A Dragon Eye AESA radars on the destroyers scanned for threats, crewed by officers trained at the Dalian Naval Academy, while electronic warfare teams monitored frequencies, ready to disrupt communications if necessary. Fuel tanks, missile tubes, and steel hulls passed within meters of one another, and at several points, miscalculations could have triggered disaster. For the United States, the Higgins's patrol, nearly 7,000 miles from its home port, was a high-stakes demonstration of credibility and principle. Every radar ping, every careful maneuver, every missile restrained in its vertical launch cell was a message to allies like the Philippines. International law matters, and freedom of navigation will be defended. The patrol was an exercise in controlled power, patience under the shadow of catastrophe. Remarkably, by the end of the day, no shots were fired, no hull was breached. The confrontation, so perilously close to disaster, dissolved without a single missile launched or gun elevated. Scarborough Shoal remained what it had always been: a reef, a fishing ground, a historic waypoint, and, on that August morning, a stage where the fragility of peace and the weight of global stakes became painfully clear. After hours of tense maneuvers, close calls, and reckless provocation, the USS Higgins sailed unscathed. No missiles were launched, no guns fired. The roar of battle never came, and yet, the silence spoke louder than any cannon could. For sailors aboard, the ordeal tested more than nerves. It tested discipline, restraint, and judgment under pressure. Every moment, every defiant move by Chinese warships, every frightened Filipino fisherman swept from their nets, demanded control over raw power. In the modern age, victory is not always measured in destruction, but in the patience to wield power without unleashing it. Scarborough Shoal stands as a symbol, a tiny ring of reefs, yet a theater for the clash between law and force. Here, the weak are shielded only by those willing to endure insult and intimidation. It is a reminder that the world's fragile peace survives only when defenders refuse to look away. And yet, lingering over the horizon is a question no one aboard the Higgins could answer. Was this confrontation merely a warning, a demonstration of restraint, or the opening move in something far larger? A shift that could redraw the rules of the sea? The shoal fades behind the waves, but the tension it holds does not. Every observer is left with the same uneasy thought. Power and patience are intertwined, but patience has its limits. One day, the balance could tip, and no one would be ready.